Hi, Mr. Kovrig. Good to see you.
Thank you.
I'm
Pleasure
glad to have you here in studio. Thank you very much for making the time. I really wanted to talk to you following our interview with the ambassador from China to Canada, where he had a very specific message that he kept delivering over and over again, which was essentially, if I could synthesize it, time for Canada and China to put aside their, and he characterized them as normal differences, and foster practical cooperation moving forward. Why do you think, after years of us requesting an interview, he at this point is willing and wanting to deliver that message?
Short answer, because China's in a bad position right now. They're struggling with their domestic economy, and they're under extreme pressure from the U.S. administration's very high tariffs. Even though those tariffs have come down, they're still much higher than they were before, and that's pushing huge pressure on China. That's also in the context of a much broader strategic rivalry and growing Cold War between China and the U.S. So he's looking to wedge Canada away from the United States. And this is a campaign that the Chinese are waging all around the world. So it's not just Canada. I've seen his counterparts in Europe trying to deliver the same message.
And what kind of reception are they getting at this point? And I'll later ask you sort of what should they be getting, I guess.
I think you're talking about in Canada, for example?
In Canada or
anywhere?
Even elsewhere. What are your observations? Like, are people aware of the risks that what they're proposing entail?
I think not enough people are sufficiently aware. I think one of the challenges we have, both in Canada, and I see this in Europe and many other countries, is there's still a huge gap between what specialists and experts, intelligence analysts inside the government, but also other researchers and scholars understand about China and about the Chinese Communist Party, how it thinks, its ideology, its worldview, and its agenda, and what the public knows and understands about it. And one of the things that I keep trying to do is close that gap, because we need a wider Canadian public and European public and Australian public to understand the challenge we're dealing with, because we are running out of time. We are in a vastly changed geopolitical situation. China is not a friendly country. The ambassador, the problem with the ambassador's talking points, he needs to update them a bit, I think. His words are friendly, his smile is friendly, but the actions of his government are ultimately harmful to Canada's interests and values, and it's the same story in Europe. They are, I think, finding purchase in some individuals, some business interests, who keep hoping for business opportunities in China. That's primarily economically driven. It's money. But the reality is the scope for cooperation between Canada and China is extremely narrow now. There are things that can be done, but it's limited.
So let me pick up on that, because I think, for example, when you were detained, the Canadian public had the most heightened, in my lifetime, awareness of the threat that China posed, and were very wary of embarking on a greater economic relationship. But time has passed since then, and we're up against, Trump all the time talking about sovereignty and economic damage with tariffs. And I wondered if you had one message for Canadians about the true threat China poses, what would it be?
That the Chinese Communist Party is an extremely powerful bureaucratic authoritarian organization, and it has a single-minded focus on a geostrategic agenda, and that agenda is China first. Make China the most dominant power in the international system so that it assures the security of the party and those Chinese elites. It dominates that system. It reshapes that system in its own image. This is not the 1960s where Mao Zedong is trying to spread communism or something, but it's rather making a world safer for an authoritarian governance system like China. A liberal international order is not a comfortable place. They want to rewrite the international order. The Chinese Communist Party wants to dominate East Asia and carve out a sphere of influence in the region where every country in the region defers and first looks to Beijing before they make a policy move to make sure that China will be okay with it. And they want to ultimately erode that system of rules and norms that Canada has benefited from for so many years. So China ultimately is hostile to an order that is good for Canada. It wants to undermine it, and it's been working to undermine it and take advantage of it for the last 25 years since it joined the WTO. And why we are where we are now, why we have all these problems with the United States, why the world is in such a disorder, is ultimately because the system that the United States and other Western powers built after World War II is fracturing, and the key source of that challenge is the rise of China and strategic rivalry, and China's undermining and free riding and exploitation of that system. It starts in Beijing.
What is the implication, or what are the implications of that for Canadian politicians as they do two things now with a new government? Embark on, trying to transform the economy here. But secondly, they're going to develop a new foreign policy. That is a campaign pledge of the Liberal Party during the election.
Right. From a foreign policy perspective, I think that job one for Prime Minister Carney and his new cabinet is to prepare this country for a much harsher geopolitical environment. China's the primary driver of that shift, and so we need a China strategy, a whole-of-government strategy where every cabinet minister is on the same page and the Chinese are not able to try to find cracks and exploit them in various ways. And to prepare this country for that challenge, it means upgrading and continuing previous work to improve competence and understanding of China, both within the government and in the expert community and in the public, and taking all kinds of measures, particularly economic but also national security measures, to strengthen Canada and prepare Canada for a much harsher world and protect the Canadian economy and Canadian citizens from harmful Chinese actions.
And on the economic front, because I think, as you mentioned, like where the argument the ambassador makes has any traction is largely within, the business community, businesses who see at a time when our most reliable partner has become the opposite, the potential to go to other markets that could supplant in size the United States. There are very few. There's basically China or India. What is your message on the economic front about whether or not necessarily if it's feasible, whether it's advisable?
I think some limited economic engagement with China is understandable, right? First, it's kind of like a Hippocratic oath for the Canadian economy. First, do no harm. We're not looking to engage in self-harming behavior. It's rather finding that intersection, recognizing that values are integral to Canadian society, to our strength as a society, that values are a Canadian interest. But values aren't just about criticizing China on human rights or things we say. It's about the choices we make in terms of particularly economic engagement. What kind of business do we do with China? So selling some kinds of commodities, not necessarily a problem. But what you want to be careful with is too much dependence on any one actor. We are seeing that with the United States now as well, right? We need to diversify our trade and investment away from China, to some extent away from the United States, toward other partners. Not to completely eliminate it, but put Canada in a position where China doesn't have the leverage to use something like the canola trade to hurt Canada and constrain our policy choices. We don't want them to be able to coerce Canada into doing things that otherwise Canadians wouldn't want to do. So business needs to be very careful. The reality is there's a common story, for example, with investment in China. A foreign company goes in, invests, develops a market, its IP is acquired, stolen, or extracted, and soon Chinese competitors rise up, replace it, it loses its market and has to exit. It's not a good story. It's not beneficial to business. But some trade is, of course, possible. It's a question of how that trade influences the Canadian economy. A key problem is that what China wants to dominate global supply chains, to control things like critical minerals and high technology. It wants to master the commanding heights of the 21st century economies, AI, batteries, solar panels, electric cars, all of those things. If China is on track to have over 40% of global manufacturing capacity, if we then end up, or the United States and our allies end up in a conflict with China, and it has that much manufacturing capacity, it dominates supply chains, and Canada has gradually been deindustrialized, and we're just, once again, hewers of wood and drawers of water. How's that conflict going to go? Not well.
I just have a few seconds left, but as you were talking, I was thinking to myself, as someone who's very familiar with sort of the political decision makers in this country, and there are some new, but there are some that remain. Like, do you believe that the people who are making the kinds of decisions you speak to are fully aware of the risk you lay out?
Yeah, I talk regularly with experts on these issues inside the Canadian government. So I can tell you that the people in our foreign ministry, intelligence agencies, defense, and so on, Industry Canada, which is also a very important piece of this, I said, they understand. I think there will be always, with a new government, there will be maybe a temptation for ministers to think that I can be the one to crack the China problem and reset relations. I think that's going to get a cold shower. It's not feasible. What is feasible is to work within that space, build stable, respectful diplomatic relations with senior Chinese officials from the Prime Minister on down, so that when there are problems and disagreements, and there are likely to be many, we can at least manage them diplomatically and constrain the likelihood that China will take even more harmful measures. It's about protecting ourselves, increasing defense spending, rebuilding the Canadian defense industrial base, and augmenting our economic security. And that's what I'm here in Ottawa this week to talk about at the B7 summit. Bolstering Canada's economic security, because the economy is a key pillar of our national security.
I will leave it on that note. Mr. Kovrig, a pleasure as always. Thanks for your insights.
Thank you.